I think ultimately the end user's response to third-party cookies is still very up in the air because if they decide, a lot of them decide, there's an easy button, I opt out of it, that will have wild implications, not just in the ad tech economy, but in the end user experience within digital. Meaning that a lot of publishers that used to rely on anonymous third-party cookie targeting as a major revenue stream no longer have that. And if they don't have a lot of first-party data to use to restore a lot of that ad revenue, then they might have to change their business models.
Welcome to the Marketing Rapport, a podcast created for and by marketing professionals who seek to better understand their consumers and design unique, personalized experiences that stand out in today's market. In each episode, hosts from Verisk Marketing Solutions connect you to industry thought leaders, practitioners, and experts focused on improving B2C experiences through powerful data-driven insights. It's about how we connect with our consumers and where we can partner together to do it better. This is the Marketing Rapport.
Welcome to the Marketing Rapport podcast. I'm Tim Finnegan, and today we're diving into the significant shift in the digital advertising landscape, Google's decision regarding third-party cookies. Google's plan to phase out these tracking technologies stirred a lot of conversations around not only consumer privacy, but by identity strategies, and is it even really happening? So third-party cookies allows companies to monitor users' online activities, playing a critical role in ad targeting and measurement. However, after receiving considerable feedback from advertisers, Google reversed its course, acknowledging the resistance from the ad industry. Now, instead of eliminating cookies entirely, Google is working on what they're calling a new experience that will empower users to make informed choices about their cookie preferences while browsing the web. But what does this mean for marketers and the future of digital advertising? To help us unpack these developments, I've got some fantastic guests today. They're experts in data, identity, and privacy, and they're going to share their insights on how this decision impacts marketing strategies, the evolving landscape of consumer privacy, and what companies should do to adapt. So I brought in a couple of my colleagues from Verisk Marketing Solutions. Before you guys talk, I've got these perfect introductions ready for you. So first of all, we've got Russ Schultz, and he serves as Verisk Marketing Solutions digital product leader and our media ad tech subject matter expert. And Russ has over a decade experience in leadership and launching ad tech products at companies of all ad sizes, with some recent stops at Nielsen Catalina Solutions, Claritas, Ocean Technologies, and others. And he is currently building new ad tech products that leverage both Verisk Marketing's digital identity and proprietary data. Also, we've got Christine Frohlich, who's our Vice President of Product and Data Governance, and she helps clients and partners navigate critical issues facing data-driven marketing companies like identity resolution, consumer engagement, and adopting data management best practices. And prior to Verisk, Christine led and helped grow several strategic areas at Experian, most recently overseeing data operations and leading their regulatory adherence program. Welcome to the podcast, Russ and Christine. Christine, this is old hat for you because this is your second time on the Marketing Rapport, where her previous episode is one of our most listened to, and she talked about the holistic approach to data governance. So welcome to the podcast. All right. So now that the dust is settled, Google announces back in July, what does this mean for marketers? Russ, let's start with you. So were you surprised at this decision, and what's your reaction to the news?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me, Tim. It's great to be here. My reaction to the news, which I think probably represents how a lot of people feel. I'm not incredibly surprised, just because third-party cookies are so well entrenched as an identity infrastructure, really, in ad tech space, and people have become so dependent on third-party cookies for a litany of reasons, from the targeting side, from the measurement side, from identity resolution side, that there's been a lot of pressure just from the whole ad tech landscape saying, hey, like I depend on third-party cookies to run my business, especially on the sell side with a lot of publishers. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to try to do, even in a phased approach. So I could see why it was incredibly hard for Google to do it in an efficient and timely manner, considering how many interdependencies there are on third-party cookies.
So Russ, when you mentioned companies and interdependencies, did advertisers really prepare for cookies going away, or were they hoping it weren't going to go away? Or talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think it just depends on the advertiser. A lot of advertisers across the board, especially now, their first and foremost strategy is how can I grow my first party data, right? Like how can I have more one-to-one connections with customers that buy from me, that interact with me. And so the advertisers that had real strong first party data out of the gate, or did a lot of successful strategies to grow them within the last 5 to 7 years, I think we're really well positioned to handle cookies going away. So the reason for that is if a first party audience does share a consented, email address or phone number or other kinds of, PII that can be tokenized into a universal identifier of some sort, that can then go into the authenticated web and be used to target people wherever they digitally frequent. But on the advertisers who don't have really great first party data or first party data yet at all, those are the ones that probably struggle a little more. They buy third party audiences built by other companies and then try to activate them in areas where people are anonymous and open web programmatic. So it just depends on the advertiser, the size of their first party data that they've acquired and built, and their tech stack and activating and targeting those consumers.
And what do you think about the dependency of these companies that have and use third-party cookies today? Change, no change? What's going on with that?
With how dependent they are, I would say, that it just, again, it depends on the customer, or I should say the entity. When you look at overall as an industry, like when cookies were being used on the buy or the sell side, it was around like 75% of the whole ad tech space was somewhat involved or very involved in cookies. It's, looking at some of the trends over the last couple of years, that's probably dipped down to around 50%. But to say that like a lot of these people who are shifting their identity strategies into something that's cookieless, they're still going to use cookies as part of their waterfall strategy. Like if cookies are available, why wouldn't you use them? You'll probably, again, prioritize targeting through the authenticated web, right, via logged in users. But if you have access to cookies to, target more consumers through the anonymous web, it's just second or third on the priority list of how you use it. So overall, like it's very much still well entrenched. It just depends on where you're looking at, how much people are dependent on it. Mostly on the buy side, it's again that waterfall approach with authenticated versus open web. On the sell side, right, with publishers, it just depends as well, because a lot of the major publishers have been driving their first party registrations a lot, so you can target through first party consented data. But the mid to small size publishers who haven't done a whole lot to grow their first party audiences for one-to-one addressability, those are the ones that probably still depend a lot on cookies as well.
So there's that dependency on cookies. And like I mentioned in the beginning, is this a final decision? Could cookies still go away? And if so, or if not, like how do companies prepare for it?
Yeah, no, great question. All we can go off of right now are signals, right? Like what are some market signals? I'm sure Google's thinking about a lot of stuff right now. The signals that are publicly available, one, Google has been talking to UK regulators about what would it be like if we actually set up a system where maybe we make an easy button option for Google Chrome end users to just opt out of third-party cookies. What if we did that? What would the market implications be of that? Potentially, like if it does, if we do make it easy for end users to do that, how will that impact Google's overall market positioning and strength? Like if a lot of third-party cookie dependent advertisers and publishers are relying on it, and that goes away through end user choice, again, it could fortify the optics of Google's strength and positioning in the marketplace. So there is that signal with UK. There's also a signal that they're still really pushing, a lot of advertisers choose their privacy sandbox, meaning that I don't think that's going away based on what they're showing and what they're advertising. So it sounds like they still want a lot of advertisers to go to that. Maybe that's because it's indicative of the fact that third-party cookie options will still deprecate, just in a different way.
So Russ, originally when we were talking about doing this podcast and having you come on, and you and Christine to talk about the cookies, you said, hey, let's give it a second. Let's not do something right now. Let's wait because there could be some stuff coming on. Actually, something just came out today. Can you just talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah. Some recent news that I think does have some indirect impacts on industry-wide cookie-wide strategy and what Google wants to do, and what a lot of companies like us and our advertising customers need to think about is the fact that recently the U.S. Google case, did come to a ruling where it was ruled that Google's search products were considered to be monopolistic, meaning that now the DOJ is reportedly going to be working with Google to figure out how to, I don't know a better word than just decoupling, or somehow working with Google to impact their search business. We don't know what the details of that could be, but ultimately that could impact, again, like how Google thinks about third-party cookies. Because if third-party cookies do go away, it could fortify Google's positioning in the marketplace, and add some optics to the whole idea of Google's monopoly or perceived monopoly in the space, right? So I think a lot of Google is thinking about how do we want to work with the DOJ, and how do we want to work with others to potentially deal with cookies and end user choice. We don't know exactly how that could impact the third-party cookies, but it's an indirect signal showing that third-party cookies could impact monopoly positioning. Monopoly positioning litigation is ensuing right now. So it could just impact the when and how third-party cookies go away.
So there's no easy answer to this thing. And that's why I appreciated having someone like you on. And I'm going to turn it over to Christine in a second, ask her some questions. But it's really helpful to try to weigh through all these changes and what it actually means to marketers. Because if you think, like in any guest I have on the podcast, it's always getting to how do we better help our customers reach the consumer? And there's just another example of it. So Christine, as I turn it over to you, a couple questions I'd like you to jump in is like, did Google make the switch just for itself, or did they make it from outside source or sources pushing back, like the ad market saying, hey, you need to do this? Like, was it an altruistic decision, or how did they get to it?
I think there's a balance between those two things. So I'm going to kind of echo what we heard from Russ earlier, which is this really isn't shocking news. I mean, year after year, we've heard Google come out and really delay the depreciation of third-party cookies, right? So having them have another announcement saying, hey, we're taking a slightly different stance here isn't necessarily shocking. And I think it is a balance of the industry's not ready yet, because we do have some advertisers who still have a large dependency on third-party cookies, even though they may have been going through this transition for many years, that there's still a need there, right? And from an economic perspective, I think we all have to appreciate the fact that there is still a dependency that is propping up our ad economy. But then I also think, Google, obviously, as being somebody who is selling ad space, wants to benefit from that, right? And so if the industry is not ready, there's no specific regulation forcing their hand. It seems like it's good business to try to say, okay, let's really think about this and maybe a little bit of a slower approach, not putting a date out there, but continuing to move down that path of eventually saying, as a company, right, Google as a company and as advertisers, there will be a point where there's less dependency on third-party cookies, and we'll be there, right? I think what I want to tell companies to do is don't think this is the end of the story. There's a lot more story left to unfold. The reality is that third-party cookies have some inherent risks when it comes to data privacy and even security, and those risks aren't going away. So I do, if I have to kind of look in the crystal ball, I think there is a chance that we're still going to see something happening. It's just going to be a little bit of a slower play than originally expected.
So Christine, let's go with that sort of angle of cookies are here to stay. What do you think the consumer is going to do versus opt out and not want to be tracked at all? So do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing whether it's a company like Google or a company like Apple proactively taking steps to give consumers really more transparency on how their information is being used and more control over how it is used. So I do think that we're moving towards a place with Google where they are going to take, I think what Russ mentioned earlier, that easy button concept where a consumer can very easily, understand, hey, there are third-party cookies tracking certain behaviors for certain companies. Am I comfortable with that or not? I also think we're starting to see a trend that, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have expected, which is that younger consumers are starting to opt out. They seem to be more engaged with those notices that they're seeing within applications or that they're seeing on websites, and they're taking the action to opt out. I do think that we still need to uncover why younger consumers are actually doing that. Is that because they're not seeing the value of a third-party cookie as consumers maybe did 10 years ago? And I think there's some possibly some truth behind that. Or is it because it's just they don't have to think as hard, right? Like you just hit opt out. I know I'm safe, right? But I think that just layers back to what I was referencing earlier, which is third-party cookies do have, inherent privacy concerns and security concerns. And so as consumers become more educated about that, and we've got young consumers who have lived in the tech age, they know it inside and out better than maybe some of the other generations. They're going to want to take action to protect their identity.
One thing, Tim, if
it'd
be okay to actually add some color here. I think ultimately the end user's response to third-party cookies is still very up in the air because it's going to, if they decide, a lot of them decide, there's an easy button, I opt out of it, that will have wild implications, not just in the ad tech economy, but in the end user experience within digital. Meaning that a lot of publishers that used to rely on anonymous third-party cookie targeting as a major revenue stream no longer have that. And if they don't have a lot of first-party data to use to restore a lot of that ad revenue, then they might have to change their business models into a subscription-based model or some kind of registration wall that impedes the user from seeing all the same content they used to and asking for more information, or that publisher may cease to exist even if they don't have viable business. So what ultimately how does it affect the end user experience? It means that they might, though they used to pay through anonymous targeting and allowing their data to be tracked, they're now going to be asked to pay up front, or their options to view content that used to be free in exchange for advertising may subside or diminish. And so as a result, that could then flip back to some end users saying, hey, I did opt out, maybe I should opt that back in. And ultimately, if it does, we want to kind of think about how end users may opt out as some barometer. When Apple did that with the IDFA a handful of years ago, the IDFA deprecated quite a bit. Like right now, about 25% of all Apple maids are IDFAs, while the rest are IDFEs. So that could be a barometer for how end users react. But ultimately, I think if this goes away, then with third-party cookies in Chrome, that completely could change how end users get to consume content that they used to think was completely free. But they might come up to with a sober reality that some of that content was never free. It was a quid pro quo in exchange for being able to target you.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us in this industry understand that in the US, we don't have a federal comprehensive privacy law. We are really a patchwork of data protection laws at the federal level. And then what we've seen happen over the course of the last 4 to 5 years at the state level with state level federal comprehensive privacy laws. So if we think about what we've seen at a federal level over the past decade, there's literally been dozens of versions of federal privacy laws that have been introduced, but they haven't progressed, right? They haven't made it to the point where they're going to get a passing vote. So it's difficult to say at what point in time the US will have a federal privacy law. But if we take our cues from what's happening globally, and in particular what we saw happen in the EU, the GDPR, my prediction is that at some point we will have a federal privacy law in the US. And that federal privacy law will have regulations around online targeting, which will likely impact third-party cookies. What those regulations are is yet to be determined, right? That's still like trying to look in the crystal ball. I think there are certain trends that we can see from what's happening at a state level. The majority of state level privacy laws aren't getting as specific as third-party cookie tracking and regulation and requirements. We do see a little bit of that happening out of California. And at minimum, I would say, as you start to prepare and think about what could happen from a legislative perspective, companies need to at least be transparent and disclose what they're doing with cookies and give consumers some optionality at really their owned and operated web level, right? So as companies, we all have this ability to be able to provide consumers control over their data and make sure that they're transparent, regardless of what federal or state legislation requires us to do, or regardless of what Google does. Each of us as a companies, right, have this opportunity to kind of get out ahead, right, and make sure that we're prepared for whatever the future might be. But also in making sure that we're disclosing, we're giving consumer optionality, the ability to control their information, really improves and engages that trust between the consumer and the brand. And I think for me, that harkens back on what we heard from Russ a bit earlier, which is consumers need to see the value in sharing their information and allowing, whether it's a third-party cookie or another tracking device, a company to really be able to collect and use their information. And so if companies really look at that as a means of creating trust, right? Having that transparency, giving consumers control, making sure there is value, regardless of what happens from a regulatory perspective, they'll be prepared. They'll be prepared to adapt, and they'll have a business model that is prepared to adapt as well.
Christine, I just want to add to that. When you talked about value and back to Russ, when he said about creating value within the publisher, I almost, and I've said this before in this podcast, I almost think like cookies make marketers lazy. Like they have to, like when I am on my Bonvoy app or United app, like they give me a reason, right? I'm giving them my information to come back and track me and offer me this, loyalty stuff. So I'm not saying that all marketers are lazy. I'm just saying that this gives an example. It could be.
Yes.
This is for both of you as product leaders, product creators. When you look at your own products that you're creating, so Russ, now, so back to you. I want you to offer your advice as a product leader. Like, what should these marketers be? What should they be worried about? Like, is it going away again? Like, how can they prepare for the future and right now?
Yeah, great question, Tim. If I was a betting man, I'd say that the highest likelihood, right? We don't know this for sure, but based on the signals we're seeing, the highest likelihood I think is that cookies could always still be around, but their scale and their viability might diminish. Meaning that, like, if we had a lot of cookies like this in the space, if end users opt out, they'll still be around, but there'll just be a lot fewer of them. And that's the assumption that I'm making about, where we need to think about going forward and where I think the industry really needs to think about. So what does this ultimately mean, though, is that for all you advertisers, vendors, compilers out there that we're preparing for a cookieless world, stay the course, stay smart, stay versatile. What does that mean on the advertiser side? More than anything, continue to build your first party data. Think of strategies that get your consumers to give you consent, to give you the identifiers you need to then go still personalize, target them and measure and market them henceforth. Also, from the advertiser end, just continue to diversify your ad budget. Think of areas of ad tech where that aren't as cookie dependent, where you still can one-to-one target, measure, and be able to really get a true understanding of your return on ad spend. More from like the ad tech channel / compiler side, just continue to keep building the pipes, right? That means that, if you have your own identity spine, you're thinking about getting one, make sure that you have cookieless identifiers that are available so that you can one-to-one target, you can one-to-one resolve identities and future-proof your graph strategy.
Russ, do you happen to know any good companies that can help with one-to-one marketing or identity?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Verisk Marketing Solution.
So, Christine, it should be ladies first, but I'm going to have ladies last for you to sort of put a bow on this. What would you suggest? Russ was more for the ad tech, the business piece of it. You can add to that, but also sort of how do these businesses, when they're building products and building marketing campaigns, really take into effect all this stuff, plus with that sort of that privacy legislation cloud looming in the future?
Yeah. And so I think the one thing that Russ said that I just want to, emphasize, because it's something that I believe and I'm passionate about it as well, is that companies need to reduce their dependency on third-party cookies, right? And that is for all of the things that we just heard Russ talk about in terms of making sure you're diversifying your ad budget, making sure that it's resilient in the event that something no longer is working as effectively as it used to, but also because that's a way for you to start to be ready should one of these state or federal privacy laws have a direct impact on the marketing tactics that you're taking. And one that was successful for you in the past may not be something that you can use in the future. So I do think that's incredibly important for companies to really start to think about that and continue to build on what they've been doing for several years, knowing that this potential of third-party cookie depreciation was looming. The other one is something that I spoke about earlier, and again, and I really want to emphasize it because it's so important, is making sure that you are transparent and you have disclosures around your use of either first-party cookies, third-party cookies, cookies that are required to make your website run. It is incredibly important. I know in the US that we don't have obligations for everyone, depending on your company, depending on what you do. But there are some really great best practices that we can kind of lift from what we've seen happen over in the EU, right? So at minimum, make sure you have the appropriate disclosures on your website. Make sure if you are collecting consumer information, you are doing so within the requirements of the existing state privacy laws we have here in the US, and that you're providing consumers their rights under law and what you should do for citizens that maybe aren't under a state privacy law, but they should have some ability to understand how their data is being used and to be able to opt out. And by doing that, you create the trust with the consumer, which helps you do what I heard Russ talk about, which is really so important, which is building your direct relationships and your first-party data. If you have first-party data, you can augment that with additional insights that help you understand your consumer better, which is going to help you create stronger relationships, make sure you're creating products and services that are going to be of value to them, and then they'll want to continue to share their information with you. So I think, you're kind of hearing some similar themes between what Russ says and what I'm saying, but that's because those are really strong, good, best practices when we start to look at what could happen, but also what consumers just expect, right? And what you need to do to be a company that is really building value with the consumer and making sure you're engaging them in very relevant ways.
That's perfect. And I'd like to end there because what you said, it's all goes back to the consumer. Like as marketers, let's always remember that. What do they want? How do they want to be interacted with? It's the whole thing of right message, right place, right time, but still remember it's that right consumer. Russ and Christine, thank you for taking time out of your day to share your expertise and transfer your knowledge to the Marketing Rapport, our legion of listeners. So thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Marketing Report. This show is brought to you by Verisk Marketing Solutions, an organization created to help CMOs and their partners improve the reach, timing, relevance, and compliance of every consumer engagement. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to the Marketing Report wherever you get your podcasts, and check out the show notes for more information.